the year 541, death arrived quietly in Constantinople, carried not by swords but by rats and fleas hidden on merchant ships. At first it was just a fever, a cough. But soon entire families were gone, streets filled with the dying and the air thickened with the stench of death. Emperor Justinian himself barely survived, yet millions of others perished. The plague spread across the Mediterranean, tearing through Europe, leaving cities empty and fields untended. Armies faltered, economies collapsed, and faith itself was shaken. Centuries later, the Black Death would return even deadlier, rewriting the fate of nations. This is the story of a silent killer that reshaped humanity forever. The city of Constantinople, jewel of the Byzantine Empire, had always been alive with sound. The clash of merchants in the bustling markets, the chanting of priests in grand basilicas, the pounding of horse hooves across the stone-paved streets. But in the year 541, something invisible slipped into the city, carried quietly on the backs of ships that docked at the Golden Horn. Rats scurried along the ropes, fleas clung to their fur, and inside those tiny creatures lived a killer that would alter the fate of the world. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper. A fever here, a sudden collapse there, sailors who had come ashore looking pale, coughing, their bodies weakening, but soon the whispers became cries. The sickness spread like fire in dry grass, leaping from home to home, street to street. It was a new and terrifying disease. Victims woke with chills and sweats, and before the day ended, their skin erupted with dark, swollen lumps, buboes. The pain was unbearable. Some died within hours, their bodies too weak to fight. Others lingered for days, writhing in agony while priests prayed over them, powerless to help. The city's heartbeat slowed. The proud markets where spices and silks once changed hands now stank of rotting food and abandoned stalls. Caravans arriving from Asia carried not treasures but death. Fishermen pulled their nets heavy with fish, but no buyers came. Even the great Hagia Sophia, the empire's spiritual center, echoed with grief instead of hymns. Emperor Justinian himself fell victim to the plague. The ruler of the most powerful empire in the world, a man who dreamed of restoring Rome's glory, now lay sweating and delirious, barely clinging to life. Though he eventually recovered, his empire would not. For every one man who survived, countless others perished. The plague tore through Constantinople with a fury no army could match. In a single day, thousands died. In a single year, perhaps half the city's population was gone. The stench of death was everywhere. Graves filled faster than they could be dug. The dead piled up in the streets. Families abandoned loved ones out of fear. Mothers fled from sick children. Priests and monks, once pillars of faith, vanished into silence, unable to answer the question haunting every survivor. Why had God abandoned them? The ships that had carried silks and spices now carried something else, terror. As Constantinople gasped for air, the plague spread outward. To Alexandria, to Antioch, to the Mediterranean islands. The disease was a wanderer, and it followed the paths of trade like a shadow. Europe did not yet know it, but its doom was already approaching. This was not merely a sickness. It was a reshaping of history. Armies would crumble. Economies would collapse. Families, villages, entire cities would vanish from the map. And yet it had all begun quietly, with a rat, a flea, and a ship gliding into the harbor of Constantinople. By the summer of 542, Constantinople was no longer the shining capital of the world. It had become a graveyard. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the smell of burning corpses. The city's wide avenues, once alive with merchants and soldiers, were choked with the dead. Some lay where they had fallen, abandoned by families too terrified to touch them. Others were dragged by carts to massive pits dug outside the walls. Pits so full that bodies spilled over the edges like water from an overfilled cup. Chroniclers of the time described scenes that sound almost impossible. Every day thousands perished. At the height of the outbreak, 10,000 lives could be lost in a single sunrise to sunset. Workers could not keep up. The empire that had built aqueducts, grand palaces, and the Hagia Sophia found itself unable to bury its dead. Fear was a living thing in the streets. People covered their faces, but cloth could not keep death away. The sound of weeping echoed from every quarter. Dogs and cats, once common companions, vanished, either killed in panic or fleeing the smell of human ruin. In the silence that followed, only the cawing of crows and the scurrying of rats could be heard. The plague did not choose its victims. It struck the poor and the wealthy, the soldier and the priest, the slave and the noble. Even Justinian, who had recovered, watched helplessly as his empire unraveled. Entire villages in Thrace and Anatolia were left without a single living soul. Farms stood empty, their crops rotting in the fields. Supply lines collapsed. Grain grew scarce and famine tightened its grip on the survivors. Religion, once a source of strength, became a mirror of despair. Some people saw the plague as punishment for their sins, throwing themselves into prayer and self-denial. Monks beat their own bodies with whips, begging God to show mercy. Others abandoned faith altogether, muttering that heaven had turned its face away. Superstition flourished. Men and women pointed fingers at foreigners, at beggars, at the Jews, at anyone who could be made into a scapegoat for the horror they could not explain. And still the ships sailed. Trade could not be stopped, not entirely, for desperation kept the ports alive. Grain was needed, oil was needed, and with every vessel that docked, the plague found new ground to conquer. From Constantinople it traveled westward into the Mediterranean, hitching rides on galleys and merchant ships. Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, groaned under its weight. Syria, already fractured by wars, was brought to its knees. North Africa was scarred. The disease swept across the sea into Italy, striking Rome, the eternal city, then Gaul, then Spain. It moved like a shadow across the face of Europe, silent but unstoppable. The Byzantine Empire would survive, but it would never be the same. Justinian's dream of reuniting the Roman world collapsed under the weight of death. The plague had done what no barbarian army could, broken the spine of an empire, and yet this was only the beginning. What began in Constantinople would echo for centuries, returning again and again like a cruel memory that Europe could not escape. By the mid-6th century, the plague that had begun in Constantinople had spread far beyond the empire's borders. It was no longer just a Byzantine nightmare. It had become a European tragedy. From port to port, city to city, the disease followed the routes of trade and war like an invisible army. Ships carried it across the Mediterranean, and from there it crawled inland through rivers, roads, and human contact. In Italy, the plague found a people already scarred by war. Justinian's campaigns to reclaim the Western Roman lands had left the peninsula fractured and starving. When the sickness arrived, it tore through soldiers and peasants alike. Rome itself, once the unshakable heart of empire, was brought to its knees. Streets that had echoed with the footsteps of senators and priests now rang only with the cries of the dying. The mighty aqueducts, engineering marvels of an earlier age, stood silent as water turned foul and abandoned. Further north, in the Frankish kingdoms of Gaul, panic reigned. The plague came in waves, striking suddenly, receding, then returning with renewed fury. Villages emptied overnight. Farmers collapsed in their fields, leaving grain to wither. Nobles who thought their wealth would shield them fled to their estates only to find death waiting there as well. Chroniclers wrote of entire households vanishing, their names erased in a matter of days. The symptoms were terrifying. Victims often woke with a slight fever or headache, nothing more than the signs of a common illness. But by nightfall their bodies were betraying them. Swollen lumps, buboes rose under the arms, on the neck and the groin, tender and black. The pain was unspeakable. Some bled from the nose and mouth, coughing up crimson foam as their lungs filled with fluid. Others fell into delirium, wandering the streets half naked, raving at demons no one else could see before collapsing lifeless on the stones. And everywhere, the same sight, death carts rattling through narrow lanes piled high with corpses. The sick were left behind locked doors, entire families sealed in their homes, abandoned to fate. The few who survived spoke of silence so deep it felt as though the world itself had stopped breathing. But the plague did not stop. It crossed the Pyrenees into Spain, leaving the Visigothic kingdom scarred. It reached the British Isles, carried by traders and raiders who thought the sea could shield them. No corner of Europe was safe. The disease killed rich and poor, Christian and pagan, young and old. Even animals seemed to vanish, sheep and cattle rotting in their fields without hands to tend them. By the end of its first great wave, tens of millions were dead. Some historians believe a quarter of Europe's population had been erased. The social order trembled. Armies shrank, cities lost their tax base, kings struggled to govern lands suddenly half empty. The very rhythm of life broke apart. Europe had entered an age of shadows. What had begun as the plague of Justinian was now a continent-wide nightmare, a dark tide that could not be contained. and it was far from over. When the first great wave of plague began to subside, Europe looked nothing like it had before. The survivors emerged into a world forever altered. Cities that had once hummed with life were silent, half-empty shells. Fields lay untended, villages stood deserted, and roads once crowded with merchants now carried only the occasional desperate traveler. The survivors did not celebrate. They mourned. Everywhere they looked, they saw absences. Families gone, neighbors vanished, entire communities erased. The economic toll was staggering. With so many dead, labor collapsed. Farmers who once toiled under the control of lords now found themselves in rare demand. A peasant could suddenly bargain for better wages, more freedom, or even land. In some regions, serfdom weakened, shaken by the sheer shortage of human hands. Landowners, unable to work their vast estates, abandoned them. Wild nature began to creep back. Forests swallowed old roads, wolves prowled near empty villages, and fields sprouted weeds where wheat should have grown. Religion, too, was shaken to its core. For centuries, the church had been the steady heart of Europe, the voice people turned to in crisis. But the plague seemed deaf to prayers. Priests died as swiftly as their congregations. Bishops fled their posts. Some believers clung tighter to faith, convinced the plague was divine punishment. Others accused the church of failing to protect them, of hiding behind holy words that rang hollow when so many lay dead. In some corners, strange cults arose, processions of flagellants who whipped themselves bloody, hoping to atone for sins they could not name. The psychological wounds ran even deeper. The constant presence of death changed how people saw the world and their place in it. Art and writing from the period reveal an obsession with mortality. Skulls and skeletons became common symbols, grim reminders that death could strike at any moment. The idea of life's fragility sank into Europe's soul. Whole generations grew up knowing nothing but loss, shaping a culture steeped in fear and resignation. And yet, despite the devastation, life found a way to continue. Survivors rebuilt in the ruins. Families began again, though smaller and more cautious. Trade slowly resumed, though every merchant carried a shadow of dread that the next ship might bring death instead of goods. Rulers tightened their grip, enforcing quarantines and punishing anyone who broke them, desperate to control what they could not understand. But the plague never truly left. It lingered, sometimes quiet, sometimes roaring back with fresh ferocity. Every few years, a town or city would flare with sudden illness, claiming new victims. People lived with the constant knowledge that the plague was not gone. It was only sleeping. Historians later called this the first pandemic, the plague of Justinian. It had killed perhaps 50 million people, nearly half the known population of the Mediterranean world. It broke empires, rewrote economies, and scarred the human spirit in ways that would echo for centuries. And centuries later, it would return in an even deadlier form, the Black Death, a wave of plague so vast and merciless that it would dwarf even the horrors of Justinian's time. Nearly 8 centuries after the plague first struck Constantinople, Europe would face an enemy far more devastating. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death arrived, a grim echo of the Justinian plague, sweeping across the continent with terrifying speed and precision. It was as if the ghosts of the past had returned to remind humanity that the lessons of history are often written in blood. The disease first appeared in ports along the Black Sea, brought by merchant ships laden with goods and rats carrying infected fleas. Genoa, Venice, and other Italian trading cities were among the first to feel its grip. From there, it spread like wildfire along trade routes reaching France, Spain, England, and beyond. Entire towns were emptied within weeks. Rural villages, often thought insulated from city horrors, were not spared. Even the remote countryside became a theater of death. The symptoms were mercilessly familiar. Buboes swelled beneath arms and in the groin, turning black and purple. Victims shivered, convulsed, and coughed until their lungs failed. Many succumbed within days, sometimes hours. Families who tried to care for the sick often became the next victims. The sheer scale of mortality overwhelmed any capacity for proper burial. Mass graves became the norm. The air, thick with decay, carried a smell that no words could soften. Social order fractured. Nobles, clergy, and peasants alike were struck down. Governments struggled to maintain control. Laws and taxes became irrelevant as fear dictated every decision. Tradesmen abandoned shops. Soldiers deserted their posts. Cities that had been centers of art, Commerce and learning were suddenly silent, with empty streets where laughter and conversation once thrived. The psychological impact was profound. Humanity came face to face with the fragility of life in a way that few events before or since could match. Art and literature became obsessed with death, the fragility of existence, and the fleeting nature of worldly power. Entire generations were lost, leaving behind a population traumatized by fear, grief, and a deep awareness of mortality. Economically, Europe was reshaped. Labor shortages allowed surviving workers to demand wages in conditions previously impossible under the feudal system. Serfdom began to decline in parts of Western Europe. Landowners faced with empty estates adapted or failed. Cities shrank and then slowly recovered. But the memory of what had been lost remained etched into the collective consciousness. And yet, life persisted. Humanity rebuilt, traded, farmed, and prayed, knowing that the shadow of the plague could return at any time. The Black Death, like the plague of Justinian centuries before, left a world changed forever, smarter in medicine, cautious in commerce, and painfully aware that no empire, no wealth, no army could stop an invisible killer that moved faster than armies, smarter than rulers, and deadlier than any sword. History remembers these plagues not just as epidemics, but as turning points, moments when humanity confronted the fragility of life and the resilience required to survive. The Black Death was the final echo of a story that began in the harbors of Constantinople, a story of death, suffering, and ultimately, survival. It reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, life endures, and history never forgets the lessons written in blood. The plagues that swept through Constantinople and Europe left scars that lasted centuries. Millions of lives were lost, entire cities emptied, and empires shaken to their core. Yet humanity endured. Societies rebuilt, economies adapted, and generations learned the fragility of life and the strength of resilience. The shadow of the plague may have passed, but its lessons remain, reminding us that even in the darkest times, life finds a way to survive and history remembers.